to my channel. My name is Martine, and if you are new here, I do videos on Vedic astrology mainly, but also with some tropical insights, and I focus on both relationship and natal astrology. And if you like this video and you would like to hear more content from me, please like, subscribe, hit the notifications bell to see when I will post a new video. And also, if you're interested in a personal consultation, please check out the video description. I will leave my contact information there. Thank you. So today is going to be a video on a topic that, well, was not specifically requested, but it yet was requested several times, and namely that is the topic of, celebrity chart analysis. And I have decided to start this topic of celebrity profiles by doing an analysis of Rudolph Valentino's chart. Now, some of you might be wondering why Rudolph Valentino. He has been dead for a long time. Maybe some of you were hoping for modern day celebrities or whatever, but bear with me because I do think that Valentino is actually a really good case study for an astrological analysis. Now, you should know that obviously when I say astrological analysis, I don't actually mean that I'm going to be looking at absolutely everything, because that would probably take me more than a day. I mean all the divisional charts and everything. Rather, what I am going to be looking at is simply the main themes that I have seen explained in his life through his astrological placements. I'm going to be looking at the Dashas and Antardashas, basically, and Chara Dashas. In other words, the way that his planetary cycles, or some way you could call them transits, have affected his life and his trajectory, both professionally and otherwise. And I'm also going to be looking at main themes in his life based on his astrological placements. So first of all, I'm going to start with a short introduction. For those of you who don't know anything about Valentino, now personally I'm no expert, but I have watched a couple of documentaries about him, and I have watched snippets of his old films. Just so you know, he has passed away for, I think it's been 95 years today. He passed away in 1926, and he was really young at the time, but he is still remembered as one of Hollywood's legends and one of the greatest screen actors of all time, despite the fact that he actually only acted in silent films. Now, some of the things that I'm just going to start with a short story on his life and some of the main themes that I have picked up on while watching documentaries about him. So he was born in May 6th, 1895, at 3 p.m. according to astrotheme.com. Hopefully this time of birth is correct, and I do think it is, because it tends to explain a lot of his life trajectory. In a small town called Castellaneta in Italy. So, and he was born to a rather middle-class family at the time. His mother was a housewife and was French. Few people know that. And his father was Italian, and he was a veterinary doctor. And Valentino also had an older brother, I think, or maybe a younger brother, I'm not even sure. He had a brother in any case. So at the age of only 18 in 1913, he decided to emigrate to the United States. According to his brother, and contrary to what people during the height of his career have tried to say, he did not move to the US because he was dirt poor, and basically he was looking for just trying his luck. The truth is that, according to his brother, he was actually driven by, quote, a sense of adventure, and he just wanted to move abroad. And you're going to see this when I get into it, that it is actually seen in his chart. It is explained why he felt this urge to move abroad. And just a few notes on that. According to his family, he was not a particularly academic type, but he was really good at athletics. stuff, athleticism, during school, but he was kind of, I don't know if he was a troublemaker, but he was not exactly a very diligent pupil when he was in school, in any case. And so kind of was hyper energetic and got bored fast. That's the general idea. And when he moved to the US, as far as the documentaries that I've seen, he didn't have an exact plan for what he was about to do there. So at first, he actually had a really rough time. He slept on park benches, and even, according to some alleged stories about him, he even worked as a paid male escort, but honestly, there is no proof to that, and most likely it was just stories that were made up to denigrate him, because as you're going to realize once I go further down the line with the story, you're going to understand why he was a very controversial and also very hated person as much as he was loved. And in particular, a lot of men hated him and were jealous, basically, and in order to denigrate him, basically made up a lot of stories saying that he was gay even when he wasn't, basically saying that he was prostituting himself on the streets when he started out in the US, etc., etc., and a whole bunch of things. But I'm going to get into that further down the line. So in any case, he really had a rough time, and from the beginning, there is this theme in his life where he gets to rely on women a lot to basically gain the little bit of attention or the little bit of success that he has. So after a series of odd jobs, he eventually catches a job that is basically described as a paid male male dance partner to rich women in this place, I think it was in New York, and this was around probably 1914 or something. And so he gets this job where he quickly becomes very popular among ladies of the good society because of his really good dance moves. So he is a really good dancer, and obviously he was young and handsome at the time, so a lot of ladies liked his company. However, from the beginning, he becomes entangled with this rich heiress who was actually frustrated because her husband was cheating on her, and basically used Valentino as kind of a comfort blanket. And also, because of her, through a series of weird events, Valentino actually ended up being imprisoned in the so-called infamous Temples prison in New York for only 3 days. And this was because supposedly this woman ended up killing her ex-husband, over some custody battle. And I don't know how Valentino was related. Well, because he was known to be connected to her and actually was kind of a witness at the trial or something. And then he tried to run away or something like that. So basically, because of his affair to this rich heiress, he ends up being in prison for a short period of time. That's one thing that you should remember. And then he finally starts a small career as a vaudeville dancer. And he starts doing shows on the road and all this stuff. And eventually, in 1917, ends up in Hollywood. And he appears in a small movie role called Alimony, which is really funny. He plays this small movie role as a dancer. And then from that, he starts to build an image among the Hollywood scene of being a very good, quote, Latin villain in small parts in the silent movies. So basically, from the beginning, he is given these movie roles that are rather negative as far as I have seen and far as I have heard from the documentaries. But at the same time, they also kind of played on this kind of mysterious, brooding, slightly sexy, dangerous aura that he showed, which very quickly started to make him popular among women. and subsequently supposedly stirred the jealousy of men, particularly American men around that time, since presumably he was deemed as, quote, a foreign invader. Because he was, quote, exotic looking, and there were, according to one documentary that I've seen, they actually made him wear white paste to cover his face to make him look paler, because he had like really kind of tanned, like most Italian people have tan skin, and supposedly they were really apprehensive about portraying this immigrant as in movies, basically, because it was so difficult to get into Hollywood to begin with, and he was a foreigner on top of that. So he really had to hustle until he finally really stepped his foot through the door. He put his foot through the door, I mean. And okay, so after this, little by little, he gets minor roles, and then finally in 1921, he gets, but finally in 1921 is the year when his first major film comes out, and it's called The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and caused him to become, quote, an overnight sensation, in part due to a tango dancing scene. So this is kind of like the movie that supposedly solidified him as a ladies' fantasy guy, and he was actually, not my words, but according to the articles that I've read, he was deemed the first male sex symbol that Hollywood ever produced. And shortly after that, he goes through a series of further films that increase his career and his popularity with the ladies, obviously, including The Sheikh that came out in 1921, Blood and Sand, which came out in 1922, and The Eagle, which came out in 1925. And also, he was supposedly idolized by millions of fans, and he was also dubbed the Great Lover, quote unquote, or the Latin Lover, quote unquote. He was married twice. First time to I think she was an aspiring actress or something, whom he met, actually all of his partners he met through his career, but this first wife was called Jean Acker, and apparently she was someone who basically tried to use him to get a career in the movies or through dancing or something when he was, starting out, basically starting to have success. And apparently Jean Acker was a lesbian, and she was a closeted lesbian, so she married Valentino, whom she had developed a friendship with, but who obviously she didn't really love, and not only that, but actually refused to give him the divorce for 3 years, which ultimately led to Valentino being jailed once again for polygamy, I think in 1922, when he married his second partner and allegedly the great love of his life, or as far as Hollywood portrayed it at the time, namely Natasha Rambova. And so basically, because Jean Acker refused to give him the divorce, he was jailed for bigamy. After that, after the divorce, he basically had to remarry Rambova in 1923. And this marriage ended in 1925, and according to the documentary that I've seen, unfortunately, Natasha Rambova also seemed to basically use him to try to start a career as a costume designer in Hollywood, and apparently even may have detracted from his image and from his progress professionally, because she would basically try to manage everything on set and try to push herself forward, and basically did everything to assert herself, and it was pretty clear that her main priority was to build a career rather than just simply have a relationship with Valentino for the sake of the relationship. So that's probably why it ended eventually, and he started supposedly dating the actress Paula Negri in 1926. However, shortly after the release of his film, The Son of the Sheikh, which opened in August 1926, he was hospitalized in New York after a ruptured ulcer and passed away a week later on August 23rd in 1926. So he was only 31 at the time. Obviously, it was pretty sad. And according to the documentary that I have watched, presumably this sudden death of his created a mass hysteria, and there were even alleged suicides of crazed female fans who became depressed because he was dead. And yeah, and there was like this storming of his funeral and all this stuff by millions of people or thousands of people or whatever. And yeah, and that was it. That was his short life description. Now, first of all, looking at these documentaries, seeing, snippets of his acting, but mostly reading things about him and looking at documentaries, 2 or 3 of them, I think, it became clear to me that there were certain themes in his life. So the first of which is the fact that he really didn't seem to have much luck when it came to relationships. Because all of the relationships that he had basically caused him more trouble than happiness, at least according to the press. So like I mentioned, he married a closeted lesbian and then married a woman who was more self-serving rather than simply wanting to have a romantic relationship. And even before the marriages, there was the situation with the heiress and allegedly a long string of affairs and all this stuff. So, of course, all of these were magnified by the press at the time, so nobody really knows 100% what happened there. But on the surface, it was pretty clear that most of the women that he ended up in relationships with were simply selfish and self-serving and basically, what do you call them? Super ambitious and parvenite, hoping to parvene, I guess, and hoping to use him as basically a meal ticket to get into Hollywood or to kickstart their own careers. And yeah, that was one theme. Another theme, obviously, is the fact that he relocated. So he moved abroad when he was very young, at the age of 18, to a country where he didn't know anybody, he didn't speak the language, and according to the documentaries that I watched also, he was actually very diligent in studying English and mastering the language, which obviously was probably necessary for him to just get by. And according to people who actually knew him, he had a very minimal accent, so he ended up speaking English very well. And let me think. Obviously, another theme is the fact that he ended up working in the movies, in the arts, and this was a person who really had almost a rags to riches story, because he wasn't born dirt poor or anything, but he was someone who took a massive chance and reached unbelievable levels of success, and all of this by the age of 30, and also passed away tragically at the age of 31. And like many of these major stars and celebrities and artists that died at the height of their fame, he became immortalized by his death. I mean, he really died at the height of his fame, truly. And that was probably one of the reasons why his, name is still mentioned even today, and why he became such a source of fascination and all this stuff. So this is what I noticed about his life. And now I'm going to get into what I've seen astrologically. I have made some notes, as usual. So if you look at the chart, if you look at the screen, you're going to see the natal chart. It's Indian style. And you see there, his ascendant was in Virgo. Now, I can tell you this, you cannot see this here, but I have seen it on the calculator, that his ascendant was in Uttara Falguni, which is ruled by the sun. And his ascendant ruler, the first thing that stands out to me is the fact that his ascendant ruler falls into the 8th house and is conjunct the sun. Now, if you've watched the video that I made on relocation, you probably remember that I mentioned one of the main single significators of moving abroad is having the ruler of the ascendant in the 7th, the 8th, the 9th, or the 12th house. And he has it in the 8th house. And also, if you watched that video, you will remember that I mentioned specifically about the 8th house that it rules countries where the language that is spoken differs from your own native tongue. So obviously, so far, checks out. He moved to the US where he had to learn English, despite the fact that he was born in Italy and presumably spoke Italian. And so we have that, first of all. So this is already a strong indicator of moving abroad. On top of that, he has Jupiter conjunct Mars in the 10th house. Jupiter conjunct Mars, by the way, Mars it gets directional strength in the 10th house. So it's directional strength, or digbala, is basically a form of exaltation, but it is calculated based on house placements. So Mars is strongest in the 10th house when it comes to house placements. And the 10th house literally rules like the big wide world. It rules the jungle of the outside world, the jungle of the corporate world. It's, the professional arena, etc., etc. And people who have Mars in the 10th house, they tend to be very driven, very ambitious. They put a lot of hard work into their career and their social image, let's say. Not necessarily social image, but how do you want to call it? Actually, the 10th house is seen as the house of social karma, something like that, like something you owe to society. And yeah, but in any case, it translates to people who put a lot of energy into their career. And also in his case, Mars rules the 3rd house and Mars rules the 8th house, which shows that his efforts, which is the 3rd house. So this is massive ambition here, which is understandable because he moved away at such a young age and really took a massive risk because he didn't speak the language, he didn't know anybody. So he went out there driven by a sheer sense of adventure. And I'm willing to bet that it wasn't just a sense of adventure, but rather that he probably felt his destiny was calling. Because you're going to see that as I progress. So he has the ruler of the 3rd house in the 10th house and also the ruler of the 8th house in the 10th house. The 8th house is the house of sexuality, and it's also the house of foreign languages and a bunch of other things. And it's also the house of death. And all of these things make sense in his case. First of all, he was known for his sexuality to some extent. First of all, his sex life was out there in the papers, his affairs were talked about. There were all these rumors about his sexual orientation, and presumably he was in constant conflicts with certain, journalists who tried to portray him as gay against his will because he really wasn't gay and he hated the idea of being called gay. And he was apparently, even around the time of his death, was in some major feud with some journalists who wrote insulting things about not just him and his masculinity, but also apparently his mother, or had insulted his mother in a previous article or something like that. So in any case, throughout his short and tumultuous life, he had a lot of enemies. And this is further emphasized by having a Scorpio Arudha Lagna, but I'm going to get into that in a little bit. So he has the ruler of his 8th house, which basically shows that his sexuality or his sex life was out there for everybody to see. It was being discussed publicly, etc., etc., and also basically was part of his status. He was known to be, quote, a sex symbol. And also his death only further emphasized his fame, like just blew his fame out of proportion. Because again, he died at the height of his fame when his momentum was highest. Right. And Jupiter is ruling the 7th, right? And the 4th houses, and it sits in the 10th house. Which, first of all, shows you that his public life is always out. His family life is always out there for everyone to see as well, because that's the 4th house. And also literally can mean he sets up house in his career, or like his career, his private life becomes very public. And also 7th house ruler in the 10th house and Jupiter shows that this person is likely to meet his romantic partner through his career or through his professional activity, which turned out to be true in his case. He literally met all his girlfriends and wives through his professional activity or his career. And let me see, what else can I see? But let's forget about the partners for a second. Let me look here at the ascendant. So let's look at his physical appearance. First of all, he has Lagna or ascendant in Uttara Falguni, which is ruled by the sun, which gives him a very good looking physique. Masculine, basically masculine, because Uttara Falguni is ruled by the sun. And the ruler of the ascendant, Mercury, is sitting in the 8th house conjunct the sun. And also, you don't see this on the screen, but I've seen it from the calculations that basically sun is Atmakarka and Mercury is Amatyakarka. So the sun is his ultimate goal in life, and Mercury is the vehicle that will help him achieve this ultimate goal in life. First of all, just by looking at this ascendant situation here, you see massive success. Amatyakarka conjunct Atmakarka shows massive success. It is one of those, I guess you call them yogas. So that gives a lot of success in life. And then when it comes to his physical appearance, because that's what I started saying, it really just heightens, his physical strength and this masculine physique, because the ruler of the ascendant is conjunct the sun, which is a very masculine planet. And the sun is exalted in Aries. So this is a lot of masculine energy here. And he actually was really athletic, and throughout his life he also largely became famous because of his dancing abilities, which has to do with the physique. But there's also this issue around him supposedly being accused of being feminine. It actually got to the point where supposedly papers were calling him a pink powdered fluff. But especially you have to remember that this was in the silent film era where everybody was wearing tons of makeup because movies were black and white, there was no sound, so all that people had was the face, basically their face and their body, to convey everything, all the emotions that they're feeling and all this stuff. So features had to be exaggerated through makeup to make them more expressive. But to me, it was kind of like, all this stuff about his masculinity and whatever would just seemed like, jealousy, if you ask me. However, I do think it is true that he did have a feminine side, obviously, because he has Moon in the ascendant. Moon in the ascendant is a placement that also actually contributes to attractiveness, but it also tends to make a person look quite feminine, especially gives a pretty face, nice features. And especially Moon in the ascendant explains why he was also popular with the ladies and why women had a massive contribution actually to his popularity and to his ultimate making as a star and as a professional success. And not only that, but it also shows that the mother is a huge influence in the development of the identity, which is further going to be emphasized by his Arudha Lagna being in Scorpio, but I will get that in a bit. I will get there in a bit. But supposedly, Valentino was very fond of his mother, so his mother was his #1 fan or something. Well, she was always supporting him, and apparently he was very devastated by her death. So he was definitely very fond of his mother and was helped by a mother figure later on, but I will get into that for a little bit later. So when it comes to his physical appearance, this is what I see. And another thing is, let me see. Right. This is pretty much the general trend that I can see just based on his natal chart when it comes to his basic personality and all this stuff. Now, to look at the nakshatras a little bit. The nakshatras, first of all, Mars, Jupiter are conjunct in Gemini. Jupiter is in the enemy sign here, so it's not the most comfortable position for Jupiter, but Jupiter is still ultimately the great benefic, so being a Gemini is not a catastrophe because it's still going to bring positive results. And they're both in the nakshatra of Ardra, which is ruled by Rahu. This is I haven't talked about it in my nakshatra series yet, but I will be talking about it at some point in the future. It is ruled by Rahu, and it is a Rakshasa nakshatra, which makes it a really rough kind of very tempestuous kind of energy. And it also, being ruled by Rahu, it makes a person very willful, very driven, and very self-reliant. Like, Rahu is going to be, like, this is actually one of those nakshatras that creates hardcore atheists, people who, they're just do-it-yourself, if you want something, go after it. And in his case, being connected to the 10th house, it is easy to understand why he had the level of drive and ambition to ultimately succeed. Not only that, but his overall chart is also further supported by the fact that Saturn is also exalted in the 2nd house in Libra. It's exalted by sign. And so he has a lot of strong planets here because he has Saturn exalted, he has Sun exalted, and he has Mars getting directional strength in the 10th house. So that's a lot of energy, a lot of drive. He had the stamina to go after what he wanted and just succeed and do it in due time, basically. And this is because of all of these planets. It's because of Mars, the Sun, and Saturn. If one of these things would have been trashed, he almost certainly wouldn't have reached the level of success that he did, taking the chances that he did. And another thing, his Sun and Mercury are conjunct. Like I said, this is the Atmakarka and the Amachakarka, and they're conjunct in Aries in the nakshatra of Bharani, which is ruled by Venus, which makes a person very artistically inclined. So his ultimate destiny was connected to arts, and Bharani is actually one of the most feminine, if not the most feminine nakshatra out there. So again, maybe this has something to do with how he was labeled as having some feminine energy, but I think this so-called feminine energy was what made him so attractive to women. Like, he probably had this way of conveying that he understood women. You know what I'm saying? Like, he had this inner understanding of what women liked and wanted and all this stuff. And it, I would say, probably ultimately led to his popularity. But it also obviously brought him some haters. And Venus, so let's finally get to the Venus situation. So let's look at his partner archetype. Venus is in Taurus. Now, if some of you have watched the video that I made about Venus as the wife in a man's chart, you probably remember that I mentioned that Venus in Taurus is actually one of the best placements that you can have. So you might be wondering, why did this person have such bad luck when it came to the wife archetype when his Venus was exalted? Well, first of all, I didn't look at his D7 and his D9 Venus situation, because those would further complete the picture. But even without looking at those, Venus in Taurus should normally give a decent partner. One that is basically going to make you happy if you're a man, and keeps you from having like wandering eyes or being too unhappy in a relationship. However, this was clearly not the case for him, and you're going to see this in detail once I get to the Arudha Lagna. You're going to understand why this was so. But just from the natal chart, so what I can see about his partner archetype, first of all, Venus is not just the ruler, Venus is not just the wife in his case, but it's also the Darakarka. So having Venus as a Darakarka means that he was clearly attracted to artistic types of women, and women who are obviously good looking, typically feminine, etc., etc. And so I guess that kind of emphasized his what do you call it, indignation at being called gay also, because he probably very clearly felt attracted to very feminine women. And not just that, but also he had Venus conjunct Pluto. So he also went for, unfortunately, Venus conjunct Pluto tends to show a lot of heartbreak and in a natal chart, and it tends to show like intense, painful relationships and transformations through relationships, which may not always be a good thing. However, Venus is also placed, so aside from being placed in Taurus, is placed in Mrigashira Nakshatra, which is ruled by Mars, which means that although he likes women who are feminine for the most part, he's also drawn to women who are quite Mars-like as well. So women who are dominant and driven and assertive, and maybe a touch, you know, on the masculine side, which again explains why he may have fallen for a closeted lesbian like Jean Acker. And aside from the Venus, it also is the Darakarka, so all of this is emphasized. He also, the ruler of the 7th, so I mentioned that the ruler of his 7th house falls in the 10th house, and it is conjunct the ruler of the 8th and the 3rd houses, which shows that he's going to meet his partner in a professional setting, and also in a place where a foreign language is spoken, or a place that is far away from the place of birth. And Venus being in the 9th house only further emphasizes this theme that he is going to meet his romantic partners in a foreign country, which obviously was true for him. But literally it is so clear in his case, because all of his partner dispositors are pointing towards foreign lands. Okay, even though normally you would think, but Rahu is about foreign lands, you don't necessarily have to have Rahu, but actually, if we're gonna look at Rahu, if you notice this, you also can see that Rahu is aspecting Jupiter, which is the ruler of his 7th house. It is not the strongest Rahu influence, but it is there. So Rahu is also adding to this idea that he will marry a foreign partner. So this is what I could see about his natal chart. Now, Arudha Lagna. Actually, I felt like kicking myself when I realized that Valentino was a Scorpio Arudha Lagna, because I should have added him to my Scorpio Arudha Lagna video. He would have been a great example. But in any case, I'm going to mention him now, and you might also want to watch that video, because I explain in depth what Scorpio Arudha Lagna plays out like, and how people perceive these people who have Scorpio Arudha Lagna. But as I mentioned in the video very briefly, they tend to be projected upon, and they tend to be seen in a sexual light. So obviously this was very clear in Valentino's case. He was called the great lover, the Latin lover, the whatever. So, and his entire image, his entire life was connected to him being a sex symbol. Like I mentioned, he was considered the first male sex symbol of Hollywood. And what else I can see from the Arudha Lagna? The Arudha Lagna and the chart based on the Arudha Lagna, all of the house placements, continued from the Arudha Lagna. What do you call it? Counterclockwise? Or is it clockwise or counterclockwise? It's clockwise. If you look clockwise, I think, you will see, so Scorpio is the first house, that is the Arudha Lagna itself, and then the 9th house is the second from the Arudha, the 10th house is the third from the Arudha, the 10th in the natal chart, I mean. Not the 10th house, it's Capricorn. So Capricorn will be the third from the Arudha Lagna, Aquarius will be the fourth from the Arudha Lagna, Pisces will be the fifth from the Arudha Lagna, and so on and so forth. Until the 12th house from the Arudha, which is in Libra. Remember that in these Indian style charts, the numbers that you see are actually signs. And so 8 stands for Scorpio. So Scorpio is the Arudha Lagna. And another thing that stands out to me is Venus falls in the 7th from the Arudha Lagna. And so, first of all, the 7th from the Arudha is ruled by Venus, and Venus also sits in the Arudha, in the 7th from the Arudha, and Venus also rules the 12th from the Arudha. Now, if you remember what I mentioned in that video, I said that for Scorpio rising, women are the enemies. Not just any women, but women who are not mothers. And in Valentino's case, actually, not just women actually, but people in the art business, because Venus rules fine arts. And Valentino had a ton of enemies, but the women in his life turned out to be his enemies. Venus in the 7th from the Arudha shows that women will be open enemies, and women will also be secret enemies. So he had women who probably confronted him to his face and told him that, they hated him or something or whatever. And also had secret enemies who were women who probably were the women that he married, who turned out to be self-interested. Which is something that you wouldn't know if you would just look at the natal chart in general. But when you look at the Arudha, it's pretty clear why, unfortunately, he was not so lucky when it came to his relationships. Because women turned out to be his enemies, right? I don't know whether this actually means that all women are going to be your enemies. Women who are not mothers, again, I stress that, because women who are mothers are shown by the moon. And in fact, more interestingly, in Valentino's case, and also in Scorpio Arudha Lagna in general, like I mentioned, the 9th house from the Arudha Lagna is ruled by the moon, which is the mother archetype. And the 9th house from the Arudha shows the class of people that will support you most in life. In his case, it was his mother. And in fact, not only his mother, but his career really took off because of a woman in Hollywood. I don't remember her name. But she was actually memorable for the 1920s because she was like a big screenwriter, either a big screenwriter or a producer in Hollywood. And I think she was a mother because she was quite, older than Valentino in any case. But she was the one who really, really believed in him and gave him his best roles. I think the one from The Shake or something. And basically pulled some strings for him and stuff, so helped him in his career a great deal. Which is explained by his chart, because his biggest supporters are going to be mother figures. And another thing that you can see is the 12th from the Arudha, that's where Saturn sits. So his enemies are not just going to be women, but also older people or the administration, which administration can literally mean government, which again could explain why he was jailed twice in his life. It was very short for both periods of time, but it still happened. Let's see. Okay, so this is pretty much what I can mention. Actually, I'm gonna save this for the end because it's a little bit of a dark subject, but I'm gonna be talking about how after the transits and the dashas and Chara Dashas and all that, I'm gonna explain how he died and when he died and how it's connected to the Arudha Lagna. Remember a long time ago, if you've watched my very first video on the Arudha Lagna, I said that you can determine the cause of birth, sorry, not the cause of death. Well, actually, yes, you can kind of estimate the cause of death, the circumstances surrounding the death, and also timing of death. But it is kind of a grim subject, so I'm gonna leave it to the end, and if you don't want to watch it, don't want to watch it. Like, I mean this, like, if you know that you're a very, like, I don't know, sensitive person and you don't want to hear this stuff, then don't listen. Right, because yeah, it is a pretty creepy thing to look at. So, okay, looking at his dasha situation, his dashas and his Chara Dashas and all this stuff. So first of all, the Chara Dashas are signs, the cycles and the signs that were dominating certain periods of time. So from around 6th of May 1907 until 1914, he was going through the Scorpio Chara Dasha. And Scorpio, in his case, activates the 3rd house. And the ruler of the 3rd house is Mars, and it sits in the 10th house, which to me explains why maybe he felt the strong drive to move away and to seek his fortune away from his home, because the 3rd house is the house of efforts, and the ruler of his 3rd is in the 10th house, right? And it's connected to foreign lands as well, because Mars also rules the 8th house, and his overall theme is about moving abroad. So I think that explains partially why he moved away, but in fact I'm going to get into even more detail in a bit. So he moved to the US in 1913 during the Chara Dasha of Scorpio, and it was also the Dasha of Rahu, the sub-Dasha of Mercury. Now, Rahu literally rules foreign places and foreign lands. So it's actually one of the things that is often talked about when it comes to Rahu, that when you go through the Rahu Mahadasha, you tend to travel more, you feel more drawn to foreign places, etc., etc. So I definitely think that had a huge impact on why he moved to the US, especially since his Rahu Dasha started in 1903. So when he was like, 8? And he finally moved at the age of 18. Well, obviously finally moved because he literally moved as soon as he could, right? He was 18, he was probably legally allowed to leave, and by himself and all that. So my impression is that he probably started developing this fascination about going abroad for a long time, but probably kept it secret. And since also Rahu is the planet, or not exactly the planet, but the point of illusions and, flashy things, and kind of lures you with the promises of fame and money and extravagant stuff. And it's also in his chart ruling, like I said, Mars and Jupiter. So probably on some level also activated the 10th house energy, because it would have brought up even stronger of these Rahu tendencies of like, I'm going to take matters into my own hands and move abroad. And aside from that, it was the Mercury subdasha. And the Mercury subdasha started on the 26th of April 1911 until November 14th of 1913. I'm not sure if he moved. I'm guessing he moved before November 1913. And so he moved during the Rahu Dasha, the Mercury Chara Dasha. And Mercury is his Amatya Karaka. and activated his 8th house, which is, so Mercury sits in his 8th house. It's conjunct the Atmakaraka, which is, and also Mercury is the ruler of his ascendant, right? So it really activated this placement that he had natally of moving abroad. Because, like I mentioned, so his natal chart, the 6th, is ruled by Mercury. It sits in the 8th house, which is a house of where shows foreign lands, where foreign languages are spoken, and he was going through the Chara Dasha of Mercury. So it was a clear activation of like, this was the right time for him to move. And also, it's actually, Mercury is also the ruler of his 10th house. That's another thing to take into account. His big break actually started during the Rahu, during the Rahu Dasha. Actually, most of his short life was under the Rahu Dasha, Mahadasha, actually. So, I don't know. I have some theories about that, but I won't get into it. So his big break started in the subdasha of Mars, which, again, activated the 10th house. It sits in the 10th house. And namely, the Rahu-Mars dasha was between 26th of April 1920 to 14th of May 1921. And this was, I think, when his first movie started out. And actually, when he got his first movie role, actually. And this dasha was then continued by Jupiter, which again further activated his 10th house, because Mars and Jupiter are conjunct in the 10th house. And the Jupiter, meaning the Jupiter Mahadasha and Jupiter Subdasha, started on the 14th of May 1921, ended on July 2nd, 1923. And after this one ended, the Jupiter Mahadasha Saturn Subdasha started on the 2nd of July 1923 until the 14th of January 1926. And this only further solidified his position as a movie star. And remember, Saturn is exalted in Libra in the 2nd house. And it's opposite his Atmakaraka and his Amatyakaraka in the 8th house. So everything is all connected in his chart and basically activated around this time. All of these aspects that show success in his chart are activated during these periods when he is given basically the best movie roles. And then on the 14th of January 1926, he enters the Jupiter Dasha Mercury Subdasha, which should have lasted until the 20th of April 1928, but sadly he passed away in August of 1926. So he passed away shortly, actually not shortly, but not too long after he entered the Jupiter Dasha and Mercury Subdasha. And I'm going to explain this when I get to the cause of death thing. Something else that I wanted to say. Something that I've seen in his Dashmansha chart, which is the D10 chart. So in his D10 chart, one of the things that stood out to me is the fact that he had Sun, which is his Atmakaraka. But in any case, even if it weren't the Atmakaraka, Sun was conjunct Mars in the 5th house of the D10 chart, which 5th house is the house of dramatic arts. He was pretty much meant to be an actor. And this is part of his responsibilities towards society. That's what the D10 chart is. Ascendant in Cancer basically showed that he was very moody and emotional, probably in his professional life, which actually tends to be explained by his persona. It also explains why, again, people perceived him as rather feminine, because obviously Cancer is ruled by the moon, and probably made him appear as quite moody and sensitive. And another thing that I noticed is ascendant in Cancer. Moon is conjunct Mercury in the D10 chart in Sagittarius. So the ruler of the ascendant of the D10 chart is in Sagittarius. And Sagittarius Chara Dasha happened between May 1914 and May 1920 when he was starting to get a career. And then he entered the Capricorn Chara Dasha from May 1920 until May 1923. And Capricorn Chara Dasha activated his Saturn in the Chara Dasha, which is, not in the chart. His Saturn in the D10, which is sitting in Capricorn in the 7th house. So the 7th house of the D10 was activated, which, if you know, 7th is actually also a strong signifier for the 10th house I meant. Right. It is also a strong signifier for starting a career. So, yeah, the 7th house is the 10th from the 10th, which is called the, what do you call it, I forgot the word, but it's a term in Vedic astrology. The Bavad Bhavam, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. It's basically like a higher octave of the 10th house. So the 7th house is also very connected to the career, and especially in the D10 chart, it is connected to the career a great deal. And this was activated during his Capricorn Chara Dasha, which lasted from May 1920 until May 1923. Right. And also, creepy enough... No, forget about it. No, I'm not going to say it. Anyway. Okay, what else can I say about his chart? Pretty much, this is the general. Okay, so I'm gonna get into what I wanted to say about the cause of death. Okay, I'm gonna say it, but then don't bash me for it. Like, oof. Okay, so the cause of death, I'm gonna give it really shortly, is the cause of death is, the circumstances surrounding your death are mainly shown by the 3rd house from the Arudha Lagna. And to a lesser extent, you also want to look at the ascendant and the 7th, or from the ascendant. Meaning, when I speak about the ascendant, I'm always talking about the Arudha Lagna. So from now on, I'm only talking about the Arudha Lagna chart. So you have to look for planets that are aspecting the Arudha Lagna, or planets that are sitting in the Arudha Lagna, or especially opposite from the Arudha Lagna. But the circumstances of death are especially described by the 3rd house from the Arudha Lagna. Now, in his case, the 3rd house from the Arudha is in Capricorn, right? The ruler of... Now, there are no planets sitting in Capricorn, as you see there on the chart. And the ruler of the 3rd house is Saturn, and it's sitting in the 12th house from the Arudha Lagna. Now, this shows, first of all, Capricorn can show things that are like sterile environments, barren environments, not a lot of vegetation. Can show institutions of state and connection to the institutions of state, things that are managed by the state. But the 12th house shows death in foreign places. Absolutely. Death in foreign places, number one. But it can also show, equally important, can show confined places. So the 12th house rules things like hospitals, asylums, prisons, anything that it has you kind of confined and in semi-isolation at least. And he died in a hospital, okay? Another thing that I can say about the cause of death is that having malefics on the 3rd from the Arudha basically shows that you are not meant to know the time of death. And his death was quite sudden. It was really sudden. And, nobody expected it. I don't even know if he expected it. Maybe he was sick and he knew this. I have no idea. I mean, maybe he knew that he had recurring sicknesses connected to this ulcer thing. But most importantly, malefics on the 10th house the 3rd from the Arudha show that you are not meant to know the time of birth. Like, even if you're trying to predict someone's time of birth while they are alive, supposedly, you're gonna mess up. Like, I don't know, this is something that I read from some ancient text that you're not supposed to know, basically, especially if there are malefics in the 3rd from the Arudha. But even if the 3rd from the Arudha is ruled by malefics, you're not supposed to know the time of death. And with Saturn ruling the 3rd, it is also, and without massive, like, signs of violence, like, I'm not seeing any, let me look. I'm not seeing, for instance, Mars aspecting Saturn or Mars aspecting the 3rd from the Arudha, so there's no sign of violence around death. Let me see about Rahu. Actually, Rahu aspects Saturn, which shows sudden death. Rahu aspecting or connected to the circumstances of death generally shows sudden death, or it can show, especially if there are other planets that show violence, it can show death by machinery like guns or something like that. Can also show death by poisons, but I don't think this is the case. Well, maybe there was some form of blood poisoning happening, that's why he died or something. But yeah. Or he died of bleeding, actually. I have no idea. How do you die of a perforated ulcer? In any case, if you have Saturn mostly without much more malefic influence, it's likely going to show illness. So you're going to die of illness, and he did. And yeah, he died suddenly, so that's shown, and he also died without knowing that he was going to die, which is pretty sad in some ways. Another thing that I see is Mercury, and this is where I wanted to get to the really creepy part. Mercury and Sun are opposite Saturn. So Mercury and Sun are aspecting. And Jupiter is also aspecting Saturn by 5th aspect. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, yeah. Jupiter is aspecting Saturn, which normally is a good thing. Like, if Jupiter is connected to circumstances of death, it eases things up. Mercury and Sun. Mercury is literally digestive system. The Sun can show a lot of things. Can show death by fire, can show blood stuff, can also show heart attacks or heart problems, cardiovascular stuff, or blood, basically. So there is some connection there as well. However, the most important and the creepy part is how this connects to his transits. And check this out. So when he died, he was in the Jupiter Mahadasha and Mercury Antardasha. So he had 2 planets that were aspecting the 3rd from the Arudha, the ruler of the 3rd from the Arudha, that were activated by transit. Well, actually by Dashas. It would have been even more interesting if I had looked at his transits, but I didn't. I'm sure that the transits are also showing things. But even without the transits, just looking at this Dasha and Antardasha situation, it's really pretty accurate. I mean, these planets that were aspecting his circumstance of death, basically, were activated around this time. And like I said, he passed away pretty shortly after he entered the Mercury Antardasha of the Jupiter Mahadasha in 1926. So the Antardasha started in January and he died in August. Right? So, yeah. I mean, that's what I can see about circumstances of death. But since I am at the circumstances of death topic, another thing that I noticed is in the 8th house from the Arudha. If you remember from the videos that I made so far about Arudha Lagna, the 8th house shows how people perceive your health. And Mars and Jupiter there shows that this person was seen as a very healthy. He was an emblem of health. Another example of a person who has Jupiter in the 8th from the Arudha is Arnold Schwarzenegger. So, and my guess is the fact that people saw him as so healthy and he was portrayed as this sex symbol and super powerful and masculine and whatever, only made it, maybe on some level, caused him to neglect himself and neglect his health, because nobody even allowed him to to consider the fact that, hey, he might have health problems. You know what I'm saying? Like, if everybody looks at you like you're some kind of a fitness guru, and let's not forget that he was a really athletic looking person. He may have suffered in silence without getting proper checkups, because he wanted to maintain this, healthy, tough image that he had. I don't know, just throwing it out there. And it certainly explains why his death was all the more sudden and shocking, because he probably, up until the end, came across as this really healthy looking person, and then suddenly passed away. Just to give you some insight into how much the planets influence our perceptions in our lives. And this has been it. Obviously, this is actually rather short description of an astral profile, but I hope you have enjoyed it nevertheless. As usual, if you haven't, please comment in the comment section. Also, if you have other famous people that you would like to see these kinds of analysis made for, please comment in the comment section also. And once again, thank you. And if you like the video, please like, subscribe, hit the notifications bell to see when I will post a new video. And if you're interested in a personal consultation, I do consultations on a wide variety of topics. And check out the video description. I will leave my contact information there. So thank you.